Part 1. The Lonely Wait. The airport terminal bustled with the typical chaos of travelers. People huddled around ticket counters, rushing to catch their flights, while others stood in long queues at the security checkpoints. The overhead announcements echoed, reminding passengers of gate changes, last calls, and boarding times. Yet, amidst this sea of human movement, there was one silent figure sitting alone in the corner, seemingly out of place. A dog. It was a small, scruffy dog, a mix of breeds that could have belonged to any number of people. Its fur was a dull brown, with hints of white around the paws and muzzle. The dog had large, soulful eyes that blinked slowly as it sat, its head turned toward the entrance, ears perked with every sound. It seemed so out of place in the hustle of the terminal. Yet there it was, waiting for someone. The dog's name was Max. He had been traveling with his owner, a man in his late 30s, dressed in a business suit and carrying a briefcase. They had been together for years, sharing everything from early morning walks to late-night movie marathons. Max had always been by his side, a constant companion, a loyal friend. They were inseparable. But that day, something had gone terribly wrong. It began with a sudden change of plans. Max's owner, Peter, had been called into an emergency business meeting and had to cut their vacation short. Their flight back had been delayed due to weather conditions, and Peter had seemed increasingly agitated as he paced the airport lounge. Max had sat quietly at his feet, looking up at him with those trusting eyes, as if sensing the tension in the air. Peter had given Max a reassuring pat on the head, telling him it would all be okay. But something in his eyes betrayed his words. Max had seen it before. The times when Peter had come home late, looking exhausted and preoccupied, or when he would leave for days at a time without any explanation. But today, there was something different, something colder in his demeanor. Max couldn't understand it, but he could feel the shift. After a while, Peter had stood up, brushing off the seat and telling Max to wait there. The dog had wagged his tail in response, hoping it was just another one of those moments when Peter needed to run off for a quick errand. Max had seen him leave the lounge before, always returning with a smile, a treat, or a toy for him. But this time was different. Peter had walked briskly toward the departure gate, without a backward glance. Max sat, waiting. Hours passed. The terminal lights dimmed as evening approached, casting long shadows across the floor. Travelers began to thin out, many of them heading toward their gates or finding a place to rest. Max's eyes remained fixed on the entrance, ears perked, as if waiting for the familiar footsteps of Peter to return. But those footsteps never came. It wasn't until the last flight had boarded and the gate announcements had stopped echoing that Max began to realize something was terribly wrong. His owner had never returned. A deep sense of unease settled in the pit of his stomach. But still, he sat there. What else could he do? He had always trusted Peter. He had always believed that his owner would come back, as he always had before. But now, Max was alone, and as the terminal began to empty, the chilling realization hit him. Peter had left without him. Part 2. The unspoken goodbye. The soft hum of fluorescent lights filled the empty terminal. A janitor wandered by, mopping the floor, seemingly unaware of the dog still sitting quietly by the abandoned gate. Max's paws were sore, his body tired, but his mind refused to give in. His owner had promised him he wouldn't be gone long. Peter would return. He always did. But as the minutes bled into hours, Max's hope began to wane. His tail no longer wagged. His eyes no longer sparkled with the same joy they once did when Peter was near. The dog's body trembled, slightly as the cold of the late evening seeped into the terminal. His stomach growled, but he paid it no mind. He had seen Peter forget to feed him before, but always with an apology and a treat to make up for it. This time, though, there was nothing. The hours dragged on. Max's eyes grew heavy, but every time he blinked, he forced them open again, searching the entrance for any sign of Peter. He had no way of knowing that. Peter had already boarded a flight, leaving the airport far behind. Max had not been abandoned intentionally. No, Peter had never been cruel or malicious toward him. But there were unspoken reasons for Peter's departure, reasons Max couldn't comprehend. The change in Peter's demeanor that day hadn't been random. It was the culmination of months of stress, personal struggles, and a decision that had been made long before they had ever arrived at the airport. In his heart, Max had been the last connection to the man who had once been everything to him. He had always been the constant, the emotional anchor when life had been too overwhelming. But somewhere along the way, Peter had let go of everything that mattered to him, including the dog that had faithfully stood by his side. Max didn't understand this betrayal. He only knew the warmth of the bond they had shared. The night deepened, and the airport seemed to grow eerily quiet. The sound of footsteps echoed across the vast terminal as a few late-night travelers passed by, eyeing the lonely dog. Max's gaze never wavered. He was waiting for someone who might never return. Part 3. The Arrival of Hope. The first signs of daylight slowly crept through the terminal windows, casting long, pale beams of light over Max's tired form. His eyes had long since lost their sparkle. The once enthusiastic dog now appeared defeated. His head hung low and his tail tucked under his body. It wasn't until the sun began to rise, casting a warm glow over the terminal, that a voice broke the silence. "Hey, little guy, are you lost?" Max looked up, his ears twitching at the sound of the voice. It was a woman, wearing a loose jacket and carrying a small backpack. She stood a few feet away, eyeing him curiously, her face a mixture of concern and pity. Max stared at her for a moment, wondering if perhaps she was the one who would bring him the answers he desperately sought. But there was nothing in her eyes that mirrored the love and familiarity he had known from Peter. She was a stranger. The woman crouched down to Max's level, holding out a hand. "Come on, boy. You can't just stay here. Let's get you something to eat." Max hesitated. He was hungry, terribly hungry. But something in his instincts told him not to move, not to follow. Something told him that if he left this spot, he might miss Peter's return. The woman sighed, a soft, defeated sound. She reached into her bag, pulling out a sandwich. Max didn't take his eyes off her, but his nose twitched as the smell of food reached him. "Look, I can't leave you here," she said softly. "You shouldn't be alone." Max's eyes flickered back to the entrance, and for a split second, he thought he saw someone walk by. His heart skipped. Was it Peter? No, just another traveler. But it was a reminder that Max wasn't the only one lost in this vast, lonely place. The woman didn't push him. She sat beside him, quietly eating her sandwich as Max stayed in his spot. She wasn't in a rush to leave him, sensing that the dog's pain went beyond a simple hunger or need for company. It was a loss. A deep, aching loss that could never truly be healed by a stranger's kindness. Jenna Part 4. The truth unfolds. Days passed, but still, Max waited. His fur grew matted, and his body grew weak. The airport staff began to notice him more. They had seen the dog sitting there for what felt like an eternity, and some had tried to intervene, calling animal control or offering him food. But Max didn't care about the food anymore. He cared only about the person who had left him behind. It wasn't until the 5th day, when a familiar face walked into the terminal, that the truth hit Max with all the force of a forgotten memory. It was Peter's face. Older, more drawn, but unmistakably his. Max's heart leapt in his chest as he wagged his tail, his body vibrating with excitement. But when Peter saw him, he didn't smile. Peter paused, his eyes scanning the dog with a mixture of guilt and sadness. Before he turned and walked away, Max didn't understand. He barked, his voice cracking with desperation. He ran toward Peter, who kept walking, his back turned, his pace quickening. Max stopped, confused, his body trembling. Why wouldn't Peter stop? Why wouldn't he look at him? In that moment, Max realized that he wasn't just waiting for Peter to come back. He was waiting for closure. But it was clear, Peter was never coming back. On Part 5, Letting Go. Max spent one final night in the terminal. The sun had long since set, and the airport had grown quiet again. The echoes of footsteps no longer mattered. The airport had become a place of memories, a place where time seemed to stretch on forever. As dawn broke once again, Max found himself sitting by the window, his body tired but his spirit stronger. He no longer looked at the entrance, no longer searched for the footsteps that would never return. And so, he let go. Max had learned the hardest lesson of all. The loyalty that had once been his greatest gift was also his greatest burden. The love he had given had not been returned in kind. And as he stared out into the horizon, he realized that sometimes, even the most loyal hearts must learn to move on. Max's journey wasn't over. There would be other places, other people, and perhaps even other companions along the way, but he would always carry the memory of the bond he had shared with Peter, a bond that had once been unbreakable, but had ultimately been lost. As Max stood up and trotted toward the exit, his heart was no longer filled with longing. Instead, it was filled with something new. Hope. The hope that he could find his way, just as he always had. And with that, Max left the airport behind, stepping into the unknown with the quiet strength of a dog who had learned what it truly meant to be free.